Hey everyone, welcome back. This is part 4 of our criminal justice series, where we're discussing and juxtaposing the American criminal justice system with the European criminal justice system. It is my pleasure to have attorney Vera Zambrano back with us today. For those of you that have missed our previous podcast episodes with Vera Zambrano, she is an international attorney practicing law primarily in the US and Europe in different legal international matters. She's also a member of the German Bar Association and the German American Lawyers Association. And she is also a member of the International Bar Association, as well as a member of the South Florida Professionals Association. And that's just to name a few. Vera, welcome back on the show. How have you been?
I'm doing great, Ramon. I'm doing really great. How are you?
Doing great, doing great. It's here in Utah, we're having some great weather. It's interesting. I've never seen this before consistently like this year, where it'll be very hot like during the day, and then in the evenings it gets it's nice and cloudy, and there's a little bit of rain. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. It's been like that for the last few days consistently, which is something that you usually see only sporadically. So it's nice. It's a
Beautiful.
good way. Yeah.
Yeah. It's getting really hot here. It's getting really, really hot.
What's the weather? How hot is it? Is it like in the 80s, 90s, over 100?
It's over the 90s. We had also over 100 last week. So it's getting really hot, but we have, the tropical weather, so it's not as dry as, for example, in Arizona, right? So we have, the wind and the tropical, the rain also.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, cool. Well, Vera, let's jump into our conversation. And before we start, really getting into it, I'd like to go ahead and give our audience just kind of a general outline of what we'll be discussing. So in today's discussion, we'll be talking about kind of theoretically first, right? Kind of the different types of prison philosophies that are out there. There's two essentially, schools of thought. And then we're going to go into and actually compare, right? These two schools of thought, which one of them is more of a punitive approach, and the other one is a more rehabilitative approach. And then we'll as a final, right, the final section of our conversation, we'll delve around like the impact on reducing repeat offenses, which another way of saying that is to reduce recidivism, right? Which ultimately translates into safer communities, which is what everybody wants, right? Everybody wants a safer community. They want to know how to accomplish that. And we're going to go ahead and discuss that in connection with these two philosophies for punishment or rehabilitation. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started on the first section. So let's talk a little bit, Vera, if you don't mind, let's talk a little bit about, like, if you can explain to us and to our listeners, what is meant by punishment-centered approach in the context of a criminal justice system?
Yeah, so when we look at punishment-centered approaches, we have to, we have different theories, why there's a punishment approach in the first place, right? We have, when we talk about punishment, it's like retribution, right? It's the oldest punishment ideology, which is focused, on the past offense rather than the offender, right? So they look at the crime, the act itself, and it should be punished because the society has a right to lawfully, proportionally punish the crime. Right. Another punishment approach is, for example, deterrence. Right. Mm-hmm. The society wants to look forward and aims to discourage future crimes. Right. And future offenders to prevent, from committing crimes in the first place, and also other offenders. Right. To commit crimes, first crimes. Another theory for the punishment approach is incapacitation. Right. That means it involves removing an individual or the offender from the society for a set period of time to prevent them from committing the same crime again or other crimes, right? So examples are like lifelong sentences, even the death penalty sometimes, right? House arrest, curfews, and electronic monitoring. So that approach, right, the punishment-centered approach, is the opposite from what we call the most modern approach, the rehabilitation. And it aims to help the offenders to change their behavior through treatments, for example, therapies, programs, educational trainings, in the facility itself, so they can live a law-abiding life in the community after the release, right? And become, lawful citizens again. So the correctional officers, officials, such as parole and probation officers, supervise clients to help them to become most productive citizens after they are released, right? So this is what we call the most modern approach. In the US itself, we have both approaches, right? The punishment, but also the rehabilitation. But we have to say very clearly that the main focus is still on the punishment approach, right? To punish the individual for the certain crime that happened. Yes, for different reasons.
Interesting. So just to make sure I understand, so if I understood you correctly, there's two schools of thought, right? The old school of thought, and then the
Mhm.
new kind of modern way of looking at things. And within the old school of thought, you've given us three different examples. But all three of those examples fall within the punishment approach. Is that
Yes,
accurate? Okay.
yes, correct. Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Awesome. Well, and then this is a perfect segue, right, with your last comment into, the next question, which is I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into the approach that, that we take here in the US. I know you already
Mhm.
mentioned that there's a little bit of both, but you think that based on your experience and based on your, understanding, right, of the American criminal justice system, you're thinking it leans more towards the punishment. Um,
Yes.
would you be able to give us is it even possible, right, to give a number, to put a number? Is it 80-20, 60-40? Um, what percentage, right? Generally speaking, and I know that this is not an exact number, but just generally speaking, how much do we lean more towards punishment than we do the rehabilitative approach?
Yes, so first we have to look at, the punishment ideology itself, right? It's dominating in the US criminal justice system today because the offender is viewed as, a bad person that has to be punished. And society has to be safe, right, from that individual. So that is a very old and a very, also very strict approach, right? So it's not very centered and looked at the individual itself, his history, the life of this person, but more into, the crime that happened, right? And the punishment is justified in terms of, as I said, the deterrence, retribution, or incapacitation. And the deterrence position that maintains that if the offender is punished, not only the specific offender, but also those who see his example, right, are deterred from further offenses. So when we look at, American society, we don't have an exact number of, how many offenders are subject to, the punishment approach, and how many are actually participating in those, rehabilitation projects. But we see a number, and that is like you will think that it's a very high number, which is in fact the case. 43% of offenders who participate in rehabilitation programs are less likely to commit a second or a third crime, right? So it's a very high number of actually, that it works, that it shows a great success, and it should be, even further emphasized. And it's definitely depending on the state, right? We have a lot of different states, very different approaches within the states, but
Right.
also it also depends on the correction facility itself, right? Do they
Right.
have the resources, right? Do they have enough, projects? Do they have enough people to actually engage in those projects? So there are a lot of different factors that play a role.
Yeah. Do you know what states are more proactive in implementing that approach, the rehabilitative approach here in the US?
Yes, so when I look at the states, right, the most modern state when it comes to rehabilitation is actually California, right?
Okay.
California and also Arizona are very modern. About the other states, I'm not quite sure. They have like more a punishment-centered approach,
Right.
but maybe, especially Florida as well, right? Florida is not a state that is geared towards the rehabilitation. It's more the punishment-centered approach. Yes.
Right. And just for clarification, right, because I think it's important to point this out, right? There's a lot of viral content going, out there about kind of what's happened in San Francisco and then what's happened in New York, where they're not punishing crime at all, and people are just stealing and committing crimes. That's not what we're talking about, right? We're not talking
Yes.
about completely letting people do whatever they want and going unpunished, right? We're just simply saying because even with the rehabilitative approach, and please correct me if I'm mistaken here, and I've seen it here in Utah where somebody will be incarcerated, but then they're able to go into specific programs, right? If they have a drug problem, they go into specific programs,
Yes.
help them kind of work on themselves. So they're still being quote unquote punished, but there's a very strong rehabilitative approach for those that are admitted into those programs, right?
Yes, correct.
Is that accurate? Okay.
Correct. So
Yeah, I
when
just,
when we look at the comparison, right, with European countries,
yeah,
then it's a very different approach, right? Like we have discussed this in a very early episode, I believe, with Norway, right? That's the Norwegian state. They have like the most modern approach when it comes to the criminal justice system itself. And we have to look at that it was very different, right? In the 70s, in the 80s, and in the 90s, it was actually almost the same incarceration rate than in the US, which a lot of people don't know, right? It was almost 70% of all the released prisoners in Norway actually recommitted crimes within only 2 years of release. So it's not that long time ago, right? We saw the same kind of development in Europe, right? In Norway, which is now considered to be the most effective and the most modern or the best criminal justice system when it comes to the recidivism rate and the incarceration rate. But they made huge developments, right? They made huge reforms in Europe, especially in the Scandinavian countries, in Norway, Sweden, and Finland, right, which are considered the best these days. So Norway's prison system is actually today very different structured than the US, right? One factor is that it's built, the idea is built, it's not so much built on punishment anymore, it's more built on to rehab, right? To give people that are incarcerated the chance to be released and then to reintegrate into society. So they have a lot smaller jails or prisons itself. And they also have very few actual, cells, prison cells. So for example, like one average prison in Norway has only 17 cells.
wow.
17 to 100 cells. So that is actually very, very small, right? Considered to the average US prison. And that is why also they focused more on the individual prisoner. And they offer a lot of programs, right? Trainings, programs, rehab projects, right? They have like a high, anti-aggression trainings, anti-drug use, right? They're centered more on the people. And also what is very interesting is in Europe, they allow a lot more family visits. In the US, I believe you have, like, by the law, 4 hours a month, like by the law. A lot of prisons give more time, right? But by the law, it's 4 hours only a month, which is nothing, right? Pretty much. So you are isolated. And in Europe, they're more targeted towards, letting family, spouses, children, spend family time. They have family rooms even, to actually, not cut those ties, right? Because when they're released, and you cannot even visit your family member in prison, you will probably most likely not make it, right? The marriage or the relationship will probably not make it. But if you allow, people and family to visit you, you can reconnect, or you can, try to maintain those bonds, right? And it's easier when you get released, because the social and the family circle is one of the most important ties, right? After the life after prison.
Yeah, wow, you touched on so many great points there. One thing that I'm curious about, so you said that was in the 70s and 80s, they had similar incarceration rates to the US. Do you know how long it took for them to make that transition into to where they are now? Because we know
Yes.
about it now, but I'm sure that even before it got, recognition on a global stage, like they had already made that transition.
Yes, so in the 90s, it was still very bad. So it changed, like they had a lot of reforms, right? It didn't happen just overnight. It takes quite a long process, right? Of some decades sometimes. So in the 90s, they were still in a very bad place, right? Compared to the US, right? Incarceration rate was high, recidivism rate was very high. And then they made all those changes and adjustments. And the late 90s, they actually saw, okay, it works, right? We have, less second offenders or third offenders, it works. They're not coming back. We have less crimes in the first place happening, right? And what is also a big difference, and that we discussed earlier, was that they are giving, milder sentences, right? And they are more geared towards probation sentences, right? Whenever it's probable, it's possible regarding the law. So the goal is definitely not to punish someone, to lock someone away, right? Like in the US, to just try to get rid of this person for a certain period of time or forever, but to more, to educate this person, to try to give this person resources, to reintegrate once they're released. So that's like the opposite approach. And as we've seen, it works really well, right? Only, I believe, 25% of, first-time offenders actually get arrested a second or third time, right? Within 5 times of release. So that is, from a very high number, over 70% to 25. That's very impressive.
It is very impressive. I have a question for you, and I don't know, 'cause I'm thinking very culturally that both countries are very different in some ways, right? And obviously there's some commonalities, but as far as the types of crimes that were being committed, like in the Norwegian countries, right? Norway specifically, I guess, because that's the one that we're talking about, that's made the huge improvements. And that might be the case for some of the other countries as well, right? Like Sweden and so forth, Netherlands and so forth. But my question is this: the types of crimes that were being committed there, were they similar to the types of crimes that were being committed here in the US?
Yes, yes. So there was no big difference in the type of crimes, right? So you had everything from, from murders to theft to burglary. You had, like sexual abuse, right, or sexual offenses. So it was not a difference in the crime itself, and also not regarding age or race, even if, like Norway definitely doesn't have as many different races, right? Like in the US, we will have, Black, Hispanic, Native, right? We have white, we have a lot of different races, of course. But in Norway these days, it's still what a lot of people in the US don't know. Sweden has like a very high percentage of, of immigrants, very, very high percentage. So it shows that despite, all those differences historically, right, in society, we see that it works for all kind of crimes, right? They just have to. It just takes a lot of time, right, to actually engage with the individual and to find out how can you help this person, right? Was this crime based on a mental problem, mental health issue, right? Was it based on decades of drug abuse, right? So you have to get to that point, to get to the ground, to see how you can help this person. Because if you don't do anything, right, and you leave this person alone, you isolate the person doesn't have any ties, any family ties. They usually don't have a relationship when they get out, right? The family doesn't really engage with them anymore. They don't have a job anymore, right? So how does society think this person could probably just reinvent himself or herself and make it work? Like the least percentage of people are really making it work and are starting over from scratch. But it takes a lot of effort. It takes resources. It takes money to actually be able to start all over again. So I think for society it is clear, right, that you cannot isolate someone because of one single certain act or crime that happened. But you have to focus on how do you support this person, right? Because you want this person to become a law-abiding citizen again, right? So there's no goal. Why would you lock someone up forever, right? That doesn't make sense. Taxpayer money also, as we discussed in another episode, right? That it's extremely costly, right? To keep people incarcerated. So, and also what I believe is, at least for last year, $1 of rehabilitation programs is almost as as effective as $4 to $5 per incarceration. So you see that it's like a lot cheap. A lot of people think, oh, it's much more expensive to actually provide rehabilitation, but it's not. When you see the long-term effect, it's way more expensive to keep someone in prison or to have people coming the second or third time, right? to provide for them, right, and to keep them incarcerated. It's much more expensive than to help someone to get out, right, and then to not get back to prison again.